My name is Chris Griffin. I am the Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to this conversation about the status of negotiations with Iran for the future of its nuclear program, and to thank on behalf of the Foreign Policy Initiative our great co-hosts for this event, the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. Incredible pleasure, as always, to be able to work with those two great organizations. If I were to give the full biographies for each of our speakers, I could use the entire afternoon. So we'll give abbreviated biographies, and because of their regular appearances on Capitol Hill and their many publications, I know that they're already very familiar to this audience. Starting from my left, Ray Takei is a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council for Foreign Relations and also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. He previously served in the State Department, and his books include The Guardians of the Revolution, Iran's Approach to the World. Next is Ali Hainonen, who served 27 years at the International Atomic Energy Agency, including as Deputy Director General of the agency. He is now a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Governance, Balfour Center for Science and International Affairs. Next, Mark Newowitz is Executive Director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Once again, many thanks for co-hosting and organizing this event, and is a leading economic sanctions expert. He's written 14 studies on the effects of sanctions and sanctions relief, and of course has testified numerous times before Congress on these issues. Last, David Albright is the founder and president of the Institute for Science and International Security. He is a leading nuclear and nonproliferation expert whose 4 books include Peddling the Peril, How the Secret Nuclear Trade Arms America's Enemies. Until about 12:45, I'll ask a series of questions of our panelists. At that point, we'll open it up for a conversation with the audience, and thank you all for turning out today. To kick off the conversation, we'll have a question for Mark, and to take a retrospective look at the Joint Plan of Action and Sanctions Relief, so where we are today before diving into the current status of negotiations with Iran. As everyone here knows, I believe that the concurrent negotiations are being conducted in accordance with the Joint Plan of Action, which was reached late last November. FDD has released a report in July estimating that Iran has received about $11 billion of sanctions relief under the Joint Plan of Action. Mark, would be really interested, first and foremost, if you have an updated estimate that you could speak to, and how you see Iran today under the JPA, and how that affects American leverage in the negotiations.
Great. Well, thanks, Chris, and thank you very much for co-hosting this. So, the Iranian economy today is still in bad shape. This is not an economy that's booming by any stretch of the imagination. But this is an economy that's undergoing a modest, albeit fragile, recovery. In fact, just recently, Iran experienced its first quarter of positive growth in 10 quarters. So this is an economy that last year, before the JPOA was agreed to in November, was an economy that had experienced a severe recession, had lost about 6.5% in GDP, was running an official inflation rate of about 40%, unofficially much higher, 70–80%. The rial, the Iranian currency, had crumbled in value, and this was an economy that, at the time, figuratively speaking, was on its back. As a result of the administration's decision to de-escalate the sanctions pressure, particularly the decision by the president to threaten a veto on the Menendez-Kirk bill, S-1881, which would have imposed sanctions in waiting, sanctions that would have been imposed if Iran had cheated on its JPOA commitments or if there had been no deal based on acceptable parameters. The decision to de-escalate the sanctions pressure, to give sanctions relief as a result of the interim agreement, direct sanctions relief, and certainly bringing in a much more competent economic team under Iranian President Rouhani. The combination of those factors has led to an economy that's no longer on its back. It's an economy that's on its knees and is slowly getting up onto its feet. And we put out an assessment as as Chris said, looking at direct sanctions relief, which we value at about $11 billion. But that really understates the amount of relief that Iran has gotten, because the real significant relief has been indirect economic activity, as illustrated by the fundamental shift in these macroeconomic indicators that I referred to earlier. So it's an economy that, again, it's not in great shape. I would say it's still in bad shape, but it's undergoing modest recovery, albeit fragile recovery, and it's not under the same severe pressure that it was under just a year and a half ago, which certainly from our perspective has at least helped enhance Iranian negotiating leverage.
And from that observation about the change in Iranian negotiating leverage, really like to turn to Ray and then Ali and David, that it seems that in the last round of negotiations that we saw in New York, that Iran is certainly increasingly defiant. That President Rouhani said last week that Iran would surrender in terms of the core issues from their perspective. And at the same time, we have signs of desperation, perhaps on the American side, where we're offering what is described as creative solutions, where we're trying to get around the intransigence on those core issues. That first, Ray, if I could ask you to speak generally to how you evaluate the current status of those negotiations. And then Ali and David, with respect to some of the specific creative solutions, you of course have written on these, would appreciate it if you could speak to what those look like and what could be some of the risks associated with those.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for everybody who's here today. It seems to have filled the room. I would say actually that the Iranian negotiating strategy has remained actually consistent. In September of 2013, I don't remember the specific date, a year ago, the Supreme Leader gave a speech where he sort of outlined his parameters or his red lines, the three no's, as they would call it in the Israeli-Palestinian context. No to shuttering any facilities, no to sending nuclear resources abroad, because if you recall, for the past few years, some of the discussions that had taken place had to do with swap deals, where Iranians would send out their enriched uranium abroad for reprocessing and to come back as fuel rods or so on. And so no to that, and no to an inspection modality that exceeds the NPT. So those were his red lines. And if you kind of look at everything that has happened since September of 2013, about a year ago, they have conformed to those red lines. The Joint Plan of Action conformed to those red lines. And so Iranian red lines have not changed as far as I can tell. And there's been some attempts to figure out creative technological formulas to accommodate those red lines. I mean, Ali and David will talk about that in more scientific detail. You don't have to shutter a facility, perhaps you can transform it for it. You don't have to send your enriched uranium abroad, perhaps you can oxidize it. You don't have to dismantle your facilities, perhaps you can disconnect it. So that's sort of an attempt to conform to those red lines. At this point, as you suggested, Chris, and all the news reports have similarly suggested, there's an impasse. And we have entered an interesting period. Both sides are trying to entice each other toward an agreement by, at least for the time being, making non-nuclear concessions. President Rouhani hinted in his speeches and interviews in New York during his recent visit to the UN General Assembly that Iran may be willing to help the United States out on ISIL, and ISIL as deference to David Albright. He wasn't suggesting helping out David Albright, so in exchange for nuclear concessions, so essentially. And you have seen senior American officials in the past couple of weeks suggest that sanctions relief can be more rapid and economic growth therefore more enhanced if Iran signs up to the nuclear agreement, and even offering a potential path to normalization of relations. So both sides at this moment are trying to entice each other and kind of lure each other into an agreement based upon their respective parameters. I'm not optimistic whether there will be an arms control agreement certainly not a satisfactory one. But I am optimistic that the negotiating process will go on. Because none of the 5+1 actually want the negotiating process to fail. And nobody wants to go back to pre-JPOA, where Iranians will expand their capacity at their own volition, and the 5+1 will try to expand pressure. So given the interest, the fact that the table serves everybody's purposes, I suspect negotiations will proceed and prolong, irrespective of the fact that they may not necessarily be a comprehensive final agreement.
Would you like to speak to some of the specific proposals that have been tabled reportedly from the American side?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me. Maybe I talk a little bit what we know about Iran's nuclear program and what we don't know, and why certain elements need to be there for, or provisions need to be in this agreement to be negotiated. And then when I say this, certainly I don't know the details of the negotiations, so there might be parameters which they have there or provisions which we just are not aware. But let's look at the big picture. Iran has reached industrial uranium enrichment capacity and capability. They have 19,000 centrifuges spinning or ready to spin in Natanz or Fordow. They have produced several tons of low-enriched uranium, up to 5% enriched, and they have produced more than 300 kilograms, 20% enriched uranium. They are manufacturing in industrial scale centrifuges. They have entered to the phase when they have a new centrifuge IR2M. And now, when we look back last 10 years, when the IAEA started to investigate this Iranian program more thoroughly in 2002, Iran has produced during this period those close to 20,000 centrifuges, have converted several hundred tons of yellow cake to UF6 feed material, so it has all the ingredients which it needs for years to come. But at the same time, the IAEA has not been able to establish whether this is all the nuclear material Iran has. IAEA has only verified what Iran has declared, but is not in a position to provide any certificate what if there is additional material which is not known. Same is true with the centrifuge program. We see those centrifuges which are there, but we don't know how many additional ones are there, and which type, and where they are. And I think that this is one of the challenges for this deal to be made. If we want to have a solid verification system, you need to know first the baseline, where you start, and then you have to have a robust verification regime where you can go and verify whether the statements are true and whether Iran is complying with its undertakings. And one of them is to verify the total number of centrifuges, because this is where the risk is. Risk is less in those centrifuges which are in Natanz. I'm sure David will talk about the breakout scenario, so I passed that one. But take just one of the recent news articles, and the one which David Sumner wrote about disabling centrifuges a week ago in New York Times, and then a few days later George Yarn from the AP wrote a similar article talking about this disconnection and dismantling and its impact to the breakout times. Iranian centrifuges were actually disconnected in 2003, December, when Iran had this suspension deal with the EU3. And this was very simple. You just remove the feed station from the centrifuge cascade, put a blind there, and attach an IAEA seal. And those days it was a good system because there were only a few hundred centrifuges. There was no real risk, and it's easy to see if they are put back in operation. Today, the situation is very different, and you have 19,000 centrifuges. So simple disconnection will buy you perhaps days, perhaps a week in breakout time when they are all back. And the best evidence to this end is the statement by Mr. Salehi, the head of the Atomic Energy Organization, who said that when they removed or disabled the feed tandem cascades, that it takes 24 hours to put it back. So then, if you want to have more time, the next step would be remove all the piping for the cascades, but leave the centrifuges intact in the cascade area. Some people have put that proposal out. Technically, it buys more time, but not that much as you expect. If you go back to IAEA reports and look the year 2012, May, Iran had close to 10,000 centrifuges. A year later, in August, they had installed almost 16,000. So in 1 year time, 5,000 new centrifuges were put in place with the piping, cooling, electronics, testing, assembling, all that. So in 1 year, 5,000 centrifuges. So if you only remove the pipes, it's much less work to put them back than install entirely all the centrifuges. So perhaps you can buy, let's be conservative, perhaps 2 months additional time by just removing the piping if you do it in a very orderly manner in putting it back. So the only solution here, if you want to have a breakout time of 1 year or more, is actually to remove all the centrifuges and piping and put them in a storage. Then it will take about a year to have all this 19,000 up and running. Mark already mentioned the uranium conversion, so I don't get that. Then, and David will talk probably the acceptable number of centrifuges, but I want to bring your attention to the IR2M, because it's much more powerful centrifuge. Now that Iran has been able to produce 1,000 of them, it means that technically they have reached what we call a semi-industrial scale. It's a demonstration plant. And we don't know how many of those centrifuges they have. We see those 1,000 in Natanz, but the question is, are there additional ones and where they are? And this is important for the monitoring scheme, that the IAEA has the verification rights to go there. And then the last point I want to mention is the possible military dimension. Why does it matter? Certainly, the long pole of the tent is the production of high-enriched uranium. But you should not ever put all the eggs on one basket. You need to know what these military guys were doing in their research centers in terms of this missile re-entry vehicle. We have to keep also in our mind that the same people and same groups of people and institutes were also involved in activities which might be nuclear fuel cycle related. And this brings us back to the verification of the completeness of Iran's declaration. These people were, and you will see it from the ISIS reports, were buying lots and lots of equipment which are nuclear fuel cycle relevant. These are facts. They are not falsified documents or whatever, because they come from various states, procurement records, customs declarations, photographs, people going. So this is solid evidence which Iran has to explain and to show where these equipment are and who is using them. So then the last point, what I would like to say, and this is a little bit from broader proliferation angle. Now, Iran has been in non-compliance with its NPT obligations. It has violated its safeguards agreement with the IAEA. It's still non-compliance, by the way, with that. And in addition, it has not followed the UN Security Council resolutions, which are binding under the international law. And still, we agree that Iran can run a small enrichment program. This creates a tremendous precedent for future proliferators. There are people here in this room and in this hill who say that South Korea should not have uranium enrichment, Japan should not have enrichment, Emirates should not have. So why can Iran have? Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Holly. David, if you'd like to elaborate on any of the points that he made, one particular proposal that I've also seen concerns the rate of enrichment that Iran could be involved than rather than its capacity to enrich broadly. If that's a proposal that you could speak to.
It's a wrong proposal.
Yes.
Well, yeah, let me, and I always said covered a lot of ground that I don't need to repeat, so thank you. Chris used this term creative process. I mean, a negotiation requires that. I mean, and my own experience is the U.S. team is pretty tough. I think that's pretty apparent. Iran, as Ray said, is holding tough. And so the question is, will the U.S. hold tough? And it'll probably go down to the last minute. So from my point of view, the U.S. will hold tough, but certainly they need our support. Now, in terms of creative ideas, again, I don't know what the U.S. or the EU3, let's say, is offering. I don't have access to that kind of information, and I'm not sure I really want to know. And the leaks, I think, are probably, in some cases, wrong, some cases incomplete. There's always a grain of truth in them, and you can discuss it from that point of view, but I think we do need to keep in mind that we're not getting the whole picture, at least those of us in the public who aren't briefed by the administration about the details. Now, I would like to give, I did learn a case of Iranian creativity, and I'll give that to show some of the problems that the negotiators face. I mean, Iran brought up the idea of SWU, I believe it was maybe in July, maybe a little earlier, and they said, look, we'll cut our enrichment our SWU by 1/3. And SWU is per year anyway, is a rate of enrichment output, and a very common term. But what they offered was that they would slow down their centrifuges, and they would reduce the rate they would feed in the uranium hexafluoride. And both of those will reduce the separative work output per year of a centrifuge. And therefore, you could get a cut of 1/3, but you wouldn't dismantle or remove or disable a single centrifuge. Now, what's the obvious problem? I mean, if you dial down the speed, you can dial up the speed very quickly. You can increase the amount of feed into the centrifuge. So it's not a serious proposal. One negotiator from an EU3 country characterized it as stupid. So, I mean, it wasn't taken seriously by the United States and its allies, but it was a serious offer from Iran, and that's part of the problem, is that Iran hasn't, in a sense, hasn't gotten it. That this is not a negotiation over the price of a house. We're not looking for the middle here, where they have 190,000 centrifuges as their goal, and the U.S. wants 1,500, and we'll just take the average. So, I mean, the goal is that Iran has to reduce the number to a very relatively small number. And that number is in debate. At my own institute, I'll try not to use ISIS. Not too much, but thank you, Ray. We could live with 3,000 to 4,000 IR-1s and accompany it with a reduction in the stocks of LEU. The U.S. position is, as the public, was 1,500 IR-1s. It will certainly be a compromise, but our number is still incredibly low compared to 20,000 or so they have now, or 190,000, or let's say 130,000, as they have said they want. And so I think the bottom line, though, is that this number that's finally in a deal has to be very low and provide what's essential in this deal, adequate warning time of reneging on the agreement. And the breakout estimates that Ali referred to really are just a conversion factor. If you want 6 months, a guarantee of 6 months to react, or a guarantee of 1 year, you can use the breakout calculations to convert into number of centrifuges. Of course, it's an estimate and it varies, and some think our estimates are too short. Actually had a country tell us they were too long, and that was an interesting experience since we do minimal estimates. But nonetheless, they're all in the same ballpark, and the bottom line is that it's a way to link the warning time you want. And Wendy Sherman put it this way, and this will be where I end, is that you want to be confident that any effort by Tehran to break out of its obligations will be so visible and time-consuming that the attempt would have no chance of success. So that's the goal.
Mark, there's no one who's followed the negotiations perhaps as closely as you. Thank you for setting the context for how we got here with the JPOA. We'd appreciate if you could offer your thoughts on how you see the process negotiations going on.
But again, I mean, with all the caveats that David wisely offered about the fact that we don't know the details. Many of you hopefully do. You're getting classified briefings by the administration. They're telling you exactly what's going on. But I would offer just in terms of what's out there in the public knowledge. I mean, I've been an outspoken critic of the administration's Iran policy since fall of last year. I was a long-time supporter of the administration's Iran policy. And the reason I changed is because I fundamentally disagreed with a philosophy where we, on the economic side, de-escalated the sanctions pressure, took away our economic leverage. By the way, economic leverage that's going to be critical if there is a deal, to enforce a deal. Because if we detect Iranian non-compliance, if we have sufficient breakout time, and we see the Iranians doing something that they shouldn't be doing, we're going to have to respond in some way. And I would prefer not to see military strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities. I'd prefer to have economic leverage that we actually retain and can use to force the Iranians back into compliance. I'm very concerned, particularly by comments by Undersecretary Sherman to Voice of America recently, that immediately after a deal, she said, we're going to give massive sanctions relief. And I think there's a big mistake in giving that economic leverage away when you're going to need it to enforce a deal. But in terms of the negotiating leverage and the U.S. negotiating strategy, I sympathize with the desire for peaceful resolution to this nuclear crisis. I'm concerned that we've given away our chips too early. The JPOA, for example, gives to Iran, at least by my count, at least 4 or 5 major concessions that one wishes we had today. The first is that we conceded enrichment to the Iranians in the JPOA to 3.5%. They had to stop, they had to suspend 20%, but they could continue enriching to 3.5%. A major concession, a major departure from U.S. policy. And in fact, a contradiction of the UN Security Council resolutions which require Iran to suspend all enrichment. Second major concession is that we allow the Iranians to continue work on advanced centrifuge R&D. And as Ali said, this allows Iran to continue developing high-powered, much more efficient centrifuges. Well, why is that important? It's important because if you can develop a centrifuge that, for example, is 16 times more efficient, which are some of the estimates about this IR-8 centrifuge that Iran has talked about, you need 1/16 the number of centrifuges that you would otherwise need if you were using IR-1s. Well, that's useful because instead of 19,000 centrifuges, you would need 1,125 centrifuges. And from Iran's perspective, the beauty of fewer centrifuges, it means a smaller enrichment footprint, and it means it's easier to hide, and therefore it's easy to develop clandestine enrichment facilities. So we've conceded enrichment to 3.5, we've conceded advanced centrifuge R&D work, which gives Iran the ability to create an industrial-sized nuclear capacity with an easier path to clandestine enrichment. The third thing is we've essentially taken ballistic missiles off the table. They're not mentioned in the JPOA. Again, Undersecretary Sherman, before a House hearing, conceded to a House member in questioning that their interpretation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1929, right, which prohibits Iran from developing long-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a warhead, is that as long as we deal with the warhead side of it, we don't have to deal with the delivery vehicle. So in a sense, we've conceded that Iran can develop intercontinental ballistic missiles as long as we have some assurance that there will be no nuclear warhead. Of course, there's no reason for an ICBM not to carry a nuclear warhead. And the fourth and final major concession is that we agreed, and this I give a lot of credit to Ray for really emphasizing this, and that is that whatever happens in the deal, whatever constraints are put in place, regardless of how stringent those constraints are, this deal will be of limited duration. It will sunset. Most of those constraints will go away. Iran will be normalized as a normal nuclear power under the NPT, subject to the same restrictions that Holland and Germany and Japan are. And there's a great danger in that, because we're not negotiating with King Willem of Holland. We're negotiating, still negotiating, with Ali Khamenei of Iran. And so the notion that somehow Iran could be normalized as a nuclear power in some period of time strikes me as a major concession to give away. We've given away those 4 major concessions as part of JPOA, and now we're negotiating with the Iranians over a comprehensive plan of action, having conceded 4 major chips that would be certainly good to have in our pockets still in these negotiations. And then I'll just conclude by this final point, because there's been much debate, particularly on the Hill, about the need for new sanctions or sanctions relief. I think Congress is got to play a role in retaining the sanction architecture that you built. This is the house you built. And in a post-deal environment, it's going to be essential that you retain this architecture, as I said, to enforce any deal, regardless of how good or bad the deal is. In fact, the worse the deal, the more you're going to need economic leverage to ensure the Iranians are not exploiting the loopholes in that deal. You built the sanctions architecture, and it's going to be critical that you play a role in ensuring that there's going to be smart relief after an Iran deal.
Thank you, Mark. I'll have one more question and then open it up for the audience. And this is directed at Ray. One concern that I have is with the natural focus on the Iranian nuclear program, that we sometimes here in Washington lose perspective on Iran's broader role in the region, which is an incredibly harmful role in the region, where it's played such an important part in sponsoring the world conflict in Syria and stabilizing Iraq. Met recently with an expert and speaking about one reason that ISIL, the terrorist organization ISIL, as opposed to our esteemed colleague institution ISIS, why the terror organization ISIL is able to use the video of Qasem Soleimani and the Iraqi town of Amarli celebrating on the ground as an incredibly effective recruitment tool in speaking to Sunni Arabs in Iran. And Ray would appreciate if you could speak broadly that either if there somehow is a deal, if there isn't a deal, the negotiations continue for the foreseeable future, how do we keep this in perspective of Iran's role?
One of the kind of unusual nature of these negotiations that both parties wanted it this way, both Iranians and 5+1, is to sort of segregate them from the region. It's sort of take these negotiations and put them in a prefabricated box and just kind of pretend that the region isn't happening. So it's a sort of technical discussion between like-minded people. And if you kind of look at the region today, I think it's fair to say it's one of the first times that there are no consequential Arab states. Egypt is inward-looking. Saudi Arabia doesn't have the capacity to police regional politics. Iraq is prostrate. Syria is at civil war. And in such an environment, you have a lot of opportunities for an intact nation state like Iran. And today, Iran is a consequential state, probably the most consequential external actor in Iraq, in Lebanon, arguably in Syria. It is essentially involved in all kinds of mischievous politics in the Gulf, the Arab side of the Gulf. So it's a kind of a expansionist state in a sense that it's exploiting opportunities that are made available to it. Now, I do think there are some organic barriers to Iran's ability to project its power. But nevertheless, in a time when the Arab state system is sort of a collapse, there's a lot of opportunities for sort of a mischievous revolutionary state. And there's a sort of a notion that, as Dennis, Eric, and I said in the piece recently, that which was born in Afghanistan in 2001, that namely, the United States requires Iran's assistance to stabilize its war-torn charges. And if you kind of look at the assistance that Iran gave to the United States in Afghanistan in 2001, I should say under the reformist government of President Khatami, you see that through evidence that has come out since, including Hassan Rouhani's memoirs, that there was a lot of concern in Iran that they would be subject to American retribution. So that cooperation was compulsive, transitory, and once that wasn't the case, largely evaporated. I don't think Iran ever helped the United States in Iraq. As a matter of fact, it did much to lacerate the American forces with munitions that it exported and militias that it nurtured. The interests of the two parties do not really mesh together well in the region. They don't in Syria. The United States would like to ostensibly depose Assad. Iran doesn't. They don't in Lebanon. I don't know if we have a policy on Lebanon, but we probably want a cohesive one. The Iranians want to empower Hezbollah, which has really emerged as an auxiliary force. They don't really in Iraq. Iranians don't really mind maintaining Shiite hegemony of power with some cosmetic Sunni involvement, while the United States would want a more inclusive state. They certainly don't on this side of the Gulf. So this coincidence of interest is not in depth, but both parties do have an interest, as I mentioned, in disarming ISIL, and maybe both parties have an interest in disarming ISIS. David Albright keeps going out his reports. But their interests certainly converge on ISIL. But I'm not even sure how that could be operationalized. So I think these sort of transitory coincidences that sometimes you see do not reflect at the core level the two countries look at the region differently and see different outcomes at the end of it. I would say just one more thing on the arms control before I stop. There was a time when a U.S. administration negotiating over Iran's civilian nuclear program suggested to the Iranians that they cannot have a completed fuel cycle, including plutonium enrichment rounds, and their inspection modalities had to go way beyond the NPT. That was the Ford administration, the Shah of Iran. So things have changed since then, and you can figure out the trajectory of that change.
David, you want to add?
Yeah, just a quick intervention. I think Mark laid out these 4 concessions. I don't know the details of the ballistic missile. But I think what strikes me is that the U.S. doesn't have a lot of negotiating room. The things Mark mentioned constrain the U.S. position dramatically. And I think one of the missiles, and also what Ray mentioned, we all remember, I hope, the case of these IEDs killing American troops, where Iran not only provided those IEDs or the equipment of the IEDs to the Iraqi insurgents, but acquired the electronics of the United States. And there was a prosecution and of that case, confessions, so it's well known, and the parties involved in it have been identified, including an agent in Iran who initiated the procurement. He's not in the IGRC, but nonetheless, we should keep in mind he was operating for somebody who was going to use this as a military weapon. And what that really means is that it's very hard to see how the UN Security Council resolution or sanctions can end. And that's really one of the responses to Mark. And this would be a case where this was not foreseen, I think, when the JPA was written. Because my memory is the UN Security Council sanctions were envisioned to come off first, if I'm correct, or early in the process. But it's hard to see how they can come off. And so I think the U.S. is limited in its ability to negotiate this, and so you have to be somewhat pessimistic right now because you don't see any walking back of Iran from these, what did you call it, Ray, the 3 no's. And we will know probably at the last minute whether Iran will walk back, but I don't think the prospects are that good. So let me end on a pessimistic note, but I think it's a realistic note.
Let me just say one quick thing, and we'll get to questions, and that is, we're talking about the United States negotiating position, our plan A, potentially our plan B. It's worth looking at Khamenei's plan B, because he talks about it. He talks about it openly. And it's very interesting to me, just in terms of the economics of it, because I think there's an assumption that we make in investment flooding into the country, ultimately a booming economy and an economic powerhouse to fuel its regional aspirations. And that may be true for a certain segment of the Iranian elite. That may be true for Rafsanjani, it may be true for Rouhani and Zarif, it may be true for the Bazaris, it may be true for a certain segment of the elite that wants to do business with Europe. But it's also interesting to look at the other part of that elite and where their economic interests lie. And Revolutionary Guards have done very well under sanctions economically. I mean, I certainly think in 2012, 2013, and certainly 2009, I think they feared for regime survival and their own survival. But once they put down the Green Movement and they've certainly moved beyond notional economic collapse, they are in a pretty strong economic position. They hold monopoly positions in key sectors of the Iranian economy. They won no-bid contracts. Khatam al-Anbiya, the RGC conglomerate, is winning contracts for everything from the energy sector to metros, to tunnels, to bridges. So the question one has to ask is, do the Revolutionary Guards want Western companies flooding in to Iran, stealing their business? Do they want Western businessmen coming into Iran and corrupting their people? Do they want trade liberalization? Do they want Iran part of the WTO? Do they want Iran to be part of the international community, as Phil Gordon talked about a few days ago at a conference in Washington? I would contend they don't. What they want is to avoid economic collapse. They want to have their economy on at least a modest trajectory. But they certainly don't want to open up the floodgates to Western investment. And so for the Revolutionary Guards, their plan B, and certainly as Khamenei has articulated, is to look for an escape hatch from economic sanctions through Russia, through China, through Turkey, through other Asian countries, that allows for the economy to stabilize and to grow moderately without taking the enormous risk to their economic interests and to their political interests that would come from a significant deal and a significant lifting of sanctions. And so, besides the three no's, I would actually suggest to you there's a fourth no. And Khamenei's fourth no is no to Western investment, Western business, and Western business people flooding my capital and corrupting my people. He has an economic escape hatch, and it gives him a very strong negotiating position vis-a-vis the P5+1.
Thank you, Mark. As we move to questions, we have a roving mic that will be coming around the room. We'll call on you, ask that you please state your name, your affiliation, and as in the style of Jeopardy, please phrase your statement in the form of a question. Sir, you up front, saw your hand first.
Hi, I'm Jack Timon. I'm a senior advisor to Congressman Kirk Clausen, Florida 19. My question is, could you discuss briefly the heavy water reactor in Iraq and the timeline and threat ultimately of a plutonium weapon?
First of all, actually the big surprise on mine 2 days ago, 3 days ago, Foreign Minister Lavrov mentioned Iraq reactor as one of the big problems of the negotiations. It has been very quiet on that area recently, and it took me by surprise why he sees it now that way. Timeline. First of all, the reactor construction has been delayed, but we don't know what happens with the components. So they probably have continued to manufacture more components because JPOA doesn't block that. So assuming that all the components are there, few needs to be manufactured, so it can start, let's say, 1.5 years from now if the deal breaks out. Then you need to irradiate the fuel. It will take another year. Then you need to cool it down before plutonium becomes available. And then you need to have a reprocessing plant. How quickly can you make a reprocessing plant is the question. Actually not that long if you got the design, which I think one could have in principle. And there I refer to a report from Pacific Northwest Laboratories, which had done a few years ago, not for Iran, but for other purposes, such kind of estimates. So it's only less than 5 years you can have. So in principle, if you got everything dressed up, the real problem is 5 years now. But then you become a hostage of that spent fuel, because spent fuel doesn't disappear, it's there. Very many people say that, okay, it's easy to ship it to Russia, to somewhere. That's going to cost a lot of money. You see, who is going to pay for that? Iranians? I don't think they have much of interest. I don't think Russians will give a free ride. So someone has to take the bill. And how much it will cost? I think that when we removed the spent fuel from a simple research reactor in Iraq in 1991, I think that the bill was 25 million US dollars at that point of time. And this is not highly irradiated, quantity is small, but it included reprocessing, so it went all the way and uranium was recovered. Today's prices, I think it's much higher, but I'm not the expert to tell. But 5 years from now, the problem will be there if something is not done. Can you modify a Iraq reactor? Yes, you can, but I would not, there are a lot of proposals, but the question is the irreversibility, so that you modify it in such a way that you cannot turn it back and start the plutonium production. And therefore, I think that like the proposal done by the scholars from Princeton, well, it's a step forward, but I don't think it's really the solution. And that solution has to go at the same time with the dismantling of the Arak heavy water production plant, because there's no need for heavy water, so why should you have such a plant?
Great. Mr. Amate, saw your hand up next. If we could get the mic to him. Anyone else wants to get into the queue? Just give me a thank you.
There's been talk of proliferation. If Iran declares it has a bomb, and we know it has a bomb, there'll be proliferation in the area. How realistic is it? And what is the threat from countries like Saudi Arabia or Egypt, taking that as a reason why they should also have nuclear weapons?
Great question. Anyone want to get it, please?
I think the proliferation risk is real. I mean, if Iran has a bomb, let's see, it conducts a nuclear test, or it's perceived as having hidden away enough weapon-grade uranium for a bomb, I think you'll see a great deal of alarm, and certainly you would worry about Saudi Arabia. I mean, our research has uncovered interest in Saudi Arabia in subjects that you're surprised by. I mean, nothing tangible related to nuclear weapons work, but a look like it's trying to bolster its technical infrastructure that doesn't fully make sense. They certainly leaked or made apparent things that they could do with Pakistan. I mean, I don't think those are very likely, but nonetheless, we know they're thinking about it and worried about it. I mean, Egypt is so unstable now, it's hard to predict anything, but in discussions we used to have at my institute with Egypt involving WMD-free zones, I mean, the people, nuclear and foreign ministry people, were pretty clear that, you know, we can live with an Israeli nuclear weapon. We don't like it, but if Iran has one, it's really going to become problematic for us. And that was against the background where Egypt at the time was bolstering its nuclear capabilities. So again, civil, but bolstering them, and then running into the problems with the IA about some potentially hidden work. So I think it's real. I mean, the U.S., as you know, will work very hard and overtime to minimize the chance that they'll develop nuclear weapons. They'll do a whole range of things with its allies, but it will be very difficult. And then you add in that it's going to add Iran nuclear weapons would add a lot of instability. So it'd be I think, much more dangerous and more difficult for the U.S. to manage.
Yes, ma'am.
Shala Sandhi from Voice of America, Korean TV. I would like to know if you believe there is going to be any major change or any change if the Senate in the next November changes hand, goes under the control of the Republicans.
Mark, that sounds like
Well, yeah, right. That's the one question on everyone's mind. Look, I think the more important question is, regardless of who controls the Senate, is particularly if your congressional staff are sitting out there thinking about what are you and your boss going to do, is to look at a number of potential scenarios. Scenario one is there is a deal. And regardless of the merits of the deal, there will be differences of opinion. I've sort of tried to make the case to you that you helped build the sanctions architecture, you should try and help retain it in a way that is smart. And I put out a report with Rich Goldberg, who used to work for Senator Mark Kirk, which I think is outside in the hall, on 12 steps to smart sanctions relief, right? Based on the assumption that many of the sanctions that are in place were put in place because of Iran's overall illicit activities. It's money laundering, it's terror financing, it's proliferation-sensitive financing, it's illicit procurement activities, it's human rights abuses. And that these sanctions, particularly these hybrid sanctions, shouldn't just go away because it's a nuclear deal. You know, we've made that mistake before. We don't want to make that again. And we want to make sure we keep these sanctions in place as a constraint against Iran's illicit activity, because after all, we convinced the international financial community that we were imposing financial sanctions not because of Iran's nuclear program, but because Iranian financial institutions represented a threat to the integrity of the global financial system. It would be somewhat ironic and somewhat self-defeating if shortly thereafter a deal is signed, we let 24 bad Iranian banks back into the global financial system because we've signed a nuclear deal. So if there is a deal, the first scenario that you need to think about is what role will Congress play in that deal, in evaluating its merits or demerits, and what will smart sanctions relief look like. And I think that's regardless if there's a Republican-controlled Senate or a Democratically controlled Senate. I think that the Senate and the House need to play a role in that. The second scenario will be, well, what happens if there's no deal? Now, Ray is right. There will be a national momentum to want to keep negotiating. But there may be a desire on the part of the administration, and certainly some of your bosses, to start thinking about new sanctions. And there, we can talk all day about what some of the new sanctions would look like. Some of them are contained in H.R. 1850, some of them are in S. 1881. But the more important question is, do we move to escalatory sanctions, massive sanctions, on the assumption that it's going to take a while for sanctions to kick in and that we need huge economic leverage? Well, some will say to you that if you do that, the Iranians will respond by restarting enrichment, not to 20%, but to 60%. And they will move ahead on the nuclear physics track in an escalatory way. So you may want to start thinking about how do you respond to that scenario, and some ideas around include calibrated sanctions, where there's certain sanctions that you can impose that will hurt the Iranians, but may not necessarily justify a significant escalatory step on the nuclear physics side. And that if the Iranians were to take such a step, it would look well out of proportion to what the United States and our allies are doing, and make it easier for us to rally international support. And then the third scenario that you need to think about, and I think, again, this is what Ray was talking to, is the perpetual rollover of the JPOA. Right? We can't get a final deal. No one wants to walk away from the table. So what we're going to do is we're just going to keep rolling over the interim agreement, maybe with a plus every 6 months. There'll be a little bit of that and a little bit of this, and the agreement will get a little bit better. It'll plug certain loopholes. The Iranians will get some more money, but this will just be perpetually rolled over. And there, the question that you may be asking, or your bosses may be asking, is the Iranian regime using salami-style tactics against us, where ultimately what they're doing is they're wearing away the efficacy of the sanctions regime by giving up small concessions on the nuclear side, all of which are reversible, but that ultimately the nuclear dial and the sanctions dial are very different in their ability to turn it up on the nuclear physics side, and our inability necessarily to properly calibrate it on the sanctions side. And that's the very simple point there is it's a lot easier to go to 60% enriched uranium than it is to impose new sanctions and build a coalition and read the riot act to the international financial community and get everybody on board, and that there's a significant lag time. So that's the third scenario. And so I'm sure there's lots of other scenarios that people could think about, but from your perspective on the Hill, your question will be, how do you respond in each of these cases? I would say that if Republicans control the Senate, there'll probably be much greater momentum to get something introduced quickly. than if the Democrats do, but it may end up being even more advantageous for the president if Republicans control the Senate on the Iran file, because it may justify his promise during the State of the Union that he has a pen and he has a phone and he will rule by executive order. It may be even easier politically to make that case if the Republicans control the Senate. But I would put the politics aside and start thinking through not political scenarios, but policy scenarios about how you and your boss are going to respond in at least the 3 scenarios that I laid out.
I'll just say one thing. If you kind of listen to what Hassan Rouhani says, and particularly the sort of day-to-day negotiated Abbas Araghchi, not so much on Mrs. Zarif, what they say is that they have changed their international landscape already. That if there's a sort of an impasse or related breakdown of negotiations, which I don't anticipate, that it'd be much more difficult in a changed international landscape to get international communities buying into more sanctions or even sanction enforcement. And I think there's something to that, actually. I do think that this particular Iranian regime has been much better at getting its message out and convincing important international actors that you don't want to resume that sort of animosity. So I think the new sanctions discussion is probably going to be introduced, should be introduced, in a less advantageous international landscape, which makes the job harder, not necessarily untenable, but perhaps more difficult. This current Iranian regime is actually much better at public relations.
Next question, yes sir. And thanks coming your way.
Scott Waddell, Center for Strategic International Studies. Just a couple of quick questions. If any of you would comment on the barter deal between Russia and Iran that's been proposed and talked about off and on, that's real, and Russia's greater position if the deal were to fail, between them offering to build power plants and the barter deal that they're talking about, and then the heightened tension between the West and Russia in general. How do you guys see that playing out if the deal falls, if they don't come to a deal? And the other thing that people are not talking much about anymore is Israel. If there is still talk about Israel taking some sort of preemptive action if they just go ahead and enrich outside the framework of the final comprehensive deal.
I speak the Russia deal. I mean, there's been a lot reported on this so-called Russia-Iran oil for goods deal. It's difficult to figure out exactly what's going on. The best we can tell is it sounds like that the deal is under discussion, but they haven't consummated the deal. It also seems to underscore what I suggested earlier, which is that Iran is planning for the day after, that it is executing on a plan B, and that the Russia oil for goods deal is an example of what Iran would do if there's no deal. So they've probably decided, because the administration has made it clear that the deal will be in violation of U.S. sanctions, they probably decided for their own reasons not to consummate the deal before, let's say, November 24th. And, but to keep the deal on the back burner, and many other deals like it, in the event that a comprehensive agreement is not reached. I even think in the perpetual renewal scenario, particularly if we keep imposing sanctions on the Russians, at some point, the Russians and the Iranians, for their own reasons, are going to move forward with business deals. And I just underscore this. There's a lot of attention given to the deal itself, how it's structured. It's oil for goods. What are the goods? Are the goods agricultural, or are they weaponry, or nuclear technology? What exactly is being traded? I think these deals are important for a much different reason. And that is that when the deals are done, it puts in place pathways, sanctions circumvention pathways, that allow for much greater sums of money to be transferred. And that these pathways are financial pathways, they're logistical pathways, and they're pathways that ultimately mean that deal will allow Iran tens of billions of dollars more than the actual deal value. And I think that's what Iran is putting in place today. It's alternative pathways that provide that escape hatch from the Western imposed sanctions. That's what concerns me most. I have only one comment on the Israel thing, and I'll let Ray talk about it more intelligently. I'm probably one of the few people in Washington who actually still believes that if there is a bad nuclear deal, that Israel will use military force. I think that the Prime Minister has been very cautious in using military force in the past. The Gaza War is really one of the first times that he's actually used it in any profound way. But I think if you listen to this Prime Minister and you understand this Prime Minister and his background and the responsibility that he believes he feels to the security of the State of Israel and to the Jewish people, as he says time and time again, I think it's inconceivable that he will allow Iran to certainly develop a nuclear weapon, and I think it's inconceivable that he'll allow Iran to retain the essential elements of the military nuclear program that will permit them with a turn of a screw, so to speak, to build a weapon. But minority opinion, so take it for what it's worth.
Sure. I don't really have any particular insight into Israeli strategic decision making. I would say that, and I think that Mark said, in some ways, JPOA will continue if there is no comprehensive agreement in November, and actually it's till January they have that vote. Even if both sides walk away from the negotiating table, they could have a SALT II scenario, where they will adhere to it without negotiations, without ratification. So in some way, I think JPOA is the first tangible negotiating agreement over 12 years of negotiations of the Iranian nuclear program, the absence of the EU3 admittedly negotiated the suspension. So it's a very tangible thing, and I suspect all the parties would want to continue it, or even, as I said, even if the negotiations are suspended for a while, adhere to it in principle. In light of that, I think it'd be difficult for the Israeli government to use force against a program that operates under some sort of an agreement and a negotiating process that continues to linger on in some ways. As I mentioned, I think the international landscape for sanctions maintenance and new sanctions is less hospitable today, and I suspect that's even more so about the use of force. There is a perception, and I think it's a widespread perception, that the Iranian regime, the Rouhani regime, is struggling against hardliners at home and is trying to forge a pragmatic move ahead, and that gives international community additional incentive for kind of maintaining its current path. David may have something to say.
No, I think I'm just like at a different point. I mean, it's slightly different. I think, again, I have no idea how Israel will respond. But I think one consideration is that the U.S. makes sure that it's viewed as sticking to the policy of preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons. That it doesn't slip. And I think the U.S. is committed to that. But in the outside world, I saw some proposals recently that essentially were criticizing our use of breakout, which from a technical point of view is a little bit like criticizing us for using a meter stick. I mean, if we see it as a conversion in a sense from warning time to number of centrifuges. So I thought it was a little displaced, but the alternative was, well, the breakout time should be determined by deployed nuclear weapons. You know, you can imagine that's a pretty long period of time. It's also unknown when they could do it. But what does that allow? Well, they could build a nuclear weapon in secret because the red line would no longer be the production of weapon-grade uranium, enough for a bomb. It would be this far out in the future date of deliverable nuclear weapons. So they could, long before that, build a nuclear weapon. They could test a nuclear weapon. And so you would no longer, that would clearly be, you would no longer have a policy to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. And so those pressures are developing in Washington, and I think they're dangerous. They're certainly counterproductive to the negotiations. I mean, the breakout that's been developed is a clean measure, helps you pick negotiating positions. It's a defensible position because it says, you know, we're going to prevent you from getting the critical nuclear material you need to build the weapon. And so you can develop things, you can learn how to test, but you're not going to have the nuclear material to do it with. And so I think in that sense, it reinforces the U.S. policy to prevent some of these others weaken that position and open up the door that maybe we could live with an Iranian bomb. And I think that would be very dangerous and could affect Israel in a negative way.
I just want to add just in terms of, again, I'm a skeptic here, but you know, the president has expressed policy of preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. I think Dave was right. I think they still remain committed to it. But what concerns me is that the U.S. negotiating position has gone fundamentally from dismantle and disclose, right, to what I would call today disconnect, defer, and deter. Right? So what do I mean by that? January of this year, Jay Carney, White House briefing, says it is the policy of this government that we will dismantle substantial portions of Iran's nuclear program. So dismantle. And now we're talking about some of these compromise ideas. Again, David's right, we don't know the details, we don't know exactly what they mean, we don't know who they're being floated by. But now we're talking about compromise ideas around disconnecting centrifuges or controlling the uranium feedstock in order to slow down the rate of enrichment. We're talking about compromises over the Iraq heavy water reactor, which would be, again, technical fixes, but they don't necessarily, or they may not necessarily require certainly dismantlement and may not even require conversion to a light water reactor. You know, we were talking about shutting down and dismantling Fordo, and now we're potentially, again, who knows based on the public reporting, it's difficult to know, but we're talking about Fordo becoming maybe an advanced centrifuge R&D facility for some other purpose. So we've started to, at least it seems that we've started to back away from dismantlement. It used to be about disclose, which Iran had to fully come clean with the IAEA, as always said on its past military or the possible military dimensions of its program. And now we're talking about, well, they don't have to do that until the deal is signed. We'll do that after a deal is signed. But of course, the notion somehow that Iran will come clean after a deal is signed when our leverage has been further diminished from where it is today seems to me as putting hope above harsh reality. So dismantle and disclose has gone from disconnect to defer. We will defer these issues until after the deal, to deter. And I'll just conclude with this. I mean, deterrence is now based on we will extend breakout. The IA will detect, hopefully, that breakout, and then we will respond accordingly. Now, whether the response will be a démarche to the Iranians, or the use of economic sanctions to force them back into compliance, or the use of military force, all options are on the table. But it also raises questions about our ability to detect, which is, as I think David, you've written on, Ollie, Gary Seymour, the fear is that the Iranian breakout may not take place in Iran's declared facilities, it will take place in Iran's clandestine facilities. Which is why the Iranians want advanced centrifuges, by the way. Which is why the Iranians, I don't think, will ever agree to go anywhere, go anytime inspections into IRGC military bases. Which is why the Iranians don't want to let us into Parchin, even though David has done a brilliant job of confirming through satellite imagery that Parchin seems to have been sanitized. Is that fair to say, David? So why don't they want to let us into Parchin if it's been sanitized? Because it establishes a bad precedent if they let us in. Because that means we now get to go into a IRGC military base. And if that's the case, then we will insist on that in any verification and inspection regime. So I don't believe Ali Khamenei, and maybe my colleagues here will disagree with me, I don't think Ali Khamenei is letting us into IRGC military bases anytime. So this will be managed access, it will be access into nuclear facilities. But Ali, I mean, you've done more of this than anyone in the room. Do you believe that at the end of the day we're going to get the kind of access we need to ensure that we could detect a clandestine Iranian breakout?
There is no perfect solution, but there is a probability for that. And it depends on your access rights, on the information which you get. And it doesn't depend only about the IAEA, it depends on the member states who may have additional information and their willingness to share that information with the IAEA. So there are a variety of things. But we have to keep in our mind also that the safeguards agreement covers the whole territory of the state. There's no sanctuary. Military places are accessible if there are nuclear activities. If you have reasons to believe that there are clandestine activities, there's a provision which is called special inspection. You can have asked that permission. We asked it in North Korea. We know now where we are. But there are tools, and also the additional protocol has another thing which is called complementary access, which is also to be used under Article 4D to the places which have not been declared. It's specified there. The dilemma with that provision is that there is no deadline in negotiation for the access, while in the safeguards agreement and special inspection there is actually a deadline. If you have a reason to believe that the information gets lost, you can ask the access. I think the maximum time to be given is 14 days. So there is a solid provision, but here you may end up with a negotiation. So I think there are tools, but you need information to come to this conclusion, and no sanctuary. And that's why, you know, I don't like giving up Parchin, because this is a test. We went to Koladus, we went to Lavisan. Lavisan was nothing left at that point of time. We went to Parchin first time, we went there for the second time. We did it in a very different way and in a very different atmosphere, but I think that Parchin is a must. And those other places which come after that, because IAEA has some other information. It's not only about Parchin.
Mark and I often have debates on this, and beginning to envy his position. Mine is, I trust my government to do the right thing. And I find myself disappointed many times. His is, I expect nothing and feel better. But I would say that, yeah, I agree with everything Mark said. You can find signals for. You know, my own experience with the discussions is they're tougher than that. They're tougher than that. But again, this is going to come down to the last minute, and I think it's going to who's going to blink first? You know, I think Iran is going to have to, or there maybe will be what Ray envisions. You know, they'll just keep rolling over. But I think the U.S. is going to hang tough.
Time for one more question. We haven't taken it from this side of the room, if anybody has one. And it looks like in the very back, perfectly located close to the microphones. Great, thank you.
Hi, Lindsay Massetti, Marine Forces Cyber Command. What are your thoughts on the developing relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Where do you see that going?
All right.
Not particularly for. There has always been negotiations and discussions between the two states. That was the case during the Iran-Iraq War, when the Saudis were subsidizing the Iraqi war effort. That we sometimes mistake dialogue for agreement. The two countries do have diplomatic relations, and they do manage the idea of the annual Hajj pilgrimage, which is a huge thing. So there's always been dialogue between the two states. But the Saudis at this particular point are so dubious and suspicious of Iranian intentions and Iranian ideology, and this plays itself into a sectarian cleavage. I mean, the Saudis haven't been comfortable with Iranian power since the Shah was deposed. They had secret agreements with the Shah that he would come to their rescue and so on. But not with the Islamic Republic. These are two states that are bedeviled by the fact that they're similar. They both try to have a reach beyond their territory, influence in the region, and that influence is predicated on a transnational ideology, different variations of Islam. So Islam is that they practice differently. So they're similar states. They try to appeal to the population of the region by using religious symbols and religious ideologies. And that's where the competition is. And right now, you have to be simplistic about it, a very sectarian, divided Middle East. So that new Cold War taking place in the region predicated, underwritten by the sectarian divide. And that puts these two countries on opposite sides of the Atlantic. I hear a lot about how Iranians and the Saudis cooperated in the early 90s to stabilize the Lebanese civil war. And to be fair, what stabilized the Lebanese civil war was the Syrian intervention. And the agreement came after that. So, I mean, this is a 35-year enmity punctured by occasions of diplomatic progress, diplomatic dialogue. The one time where there was attempts to reconcile relations between the two was during the reformist government in '97, because that reformist government came in with a very different international orientation. All these issues will be much more easier resolved with this sort of a reformist government, because it was the only faction within the Islamic politics that had interest in international norms. And as a sort of a guidepost, not so much the successors, the conservatives, or even the so-called pragmatists. So I don't see that relationship taking off the way it is said. I do think there'll be dialogue between the two states. You may see visits. People tend to forget, President Ahmadinejad visited Saudi Arabia, and he was welcomed by, at that time, Crown Prince Abdullah. So that goes on.
As we near the end of our time, if we could conclude with a lightning round, would appreciate it in sort of 1 minute that for the folks here who are congressional staffers, as they go back to their bosses and advising their bosses on what to look for the end of negotiations, or for any topics that should have been discussed today and haven't been in. Starting with you, Ray, about 1 minute each, sort of your top line message that congressional staff and other experts need to take away from this conversation.
I would just say that whatever ebbs and flows of the nuclear negotiations are, and we do have a problem with Islamic Republic as a revisionist revolutionary actor in the Middle East. In the Middle East, that gives it ample opportunities. And I do think we should also focus on domestic abuses, human rights issues, governance issues. I mean, you cannot separate. It is hard to suggest a government will abide by international norms when it violates domestic norms. Islamic Republic violates its own laws today about incarceration, human rights abuses. So it cannot be selectively compliant with international norms and international treaty obligations when it is practices the domestic abuses that it does and regional subversion which is engaged in.
Very well put.
Success is never accident, it's a result of hard work. And for the IAEA to succeed and the verification regime to succeed, it has to have a proper access rights, unfettered access to the sites, including the military sites, information to be provided by Iran, with scope beyond normal safeguards agreement. But then, as an additional thing which might surprise you, I would suggest that the P5+1 asked the IAEA also make the report from the very beginning open with the numbers so that the international community can see the real implementation and how well it goes. So it doesn't need to listen gossips.
Should I go before you?
Sure.
Well,
no, you could sum up on an optimistic note.
Yeah, okay, because I'll be Pollyanna or whatever. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to
let you send them along their way feeling more positive than I'm going to. Look, I think diplomacy is incredibly important. Access to information is vital, but power politics is about leverage. The only way that we're going to ever deal with this Iranian regime, given its nature, is to retain and enhance our leverage. In the past year, we have systematically, unilaterally diminished our leverage in our pursuit of a zone of possible agreement with Iran over arms control issues. I think you, as members of Congress and staffers, you have built the leverage that has allowed this administration to approach these negotiations with a degree of seriousness. and it'll be up to you, because you are ultimately the last firewall against the bad Iranian nuclear deal. And you need to retain and you need to enhance the sanctions architecture that deals with Iran's range of illicit activities which will, I guarantee you, survive any nuclear deal with Iran. So smart sanctions relief and enhanced pressure is ultimately going to guarantee or at least enhance the likelihood of a successful nuclear deal.
I think it's very important that the administration gets a message that these strong negotiating positions have to be maintained. I mean, some know exactly what's going on and can help inform that effort. I also think it's important to start thinking of Plan B. It doesn't look great to get a deal in November right now, and I think it needs to be thought through. And the administration needs to be pressed to think through, so we're not scrambling at the last minute. Iran appears to have thought it through. The other is that if there isn't a good deal, I think it's going to be very important that Congress and administration are united. That I think a fight could be very destructive and play into the interests of Iran. So one scenario would be if the administration vetoes congressional legislation and they win. It would be very destructive and it'd be very hard for Congress to recover as the strong force for sanctions in the world, which I think is recognized everywhere. That in a sense, that battle cannot be lost by Congress. So I think it's important to think through carefully how to proceed in case there is no good deal.
Great. Want to thank, first and foremost, our partners in hosting this event, the Bipartisan Policy Center, of course, FPD, Executive Director of Marketing Woods. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Ask you all to join in thanking our panelists for their time and expertise.